Imagine walking into a dealership to buy a car and getting treated like you don't belong. What would you do next? The sun sat high over Scottsdale, Arizona, burning the pavement outside Westward Motors, a luxury car dealership lined with pristine vehicles glistening under the desert heat inside the air conditioning, hummed softly keeping the showroom cool, while a few well-dressed customers sipped complimentary espresso through the glass doors. An elderly man stepped inside. Marshall Dupree, 72 years old, walked with a steady gait, his worn-out leather loafers tapping lightly against the marble floors, dressed in a simple navy sweater and khaki slacks. He blended into the background, an unassuming figure in a place built to impress. He took his time hands tucked in his pockets as he admired the lineup of high-end vehicles. A deep blue Mercedes-Benz S-Class caught his eye. Sleek polished, a machine built for quiet power. That was the one. Marshall glanced around, waiting for a salesman. Nothing. 3 salesmen stood near the reception desk, laughing quietly among themselves. One leaned against the desk, eyes on his phone. Another nodded towards a young couple in designer clothes and strolled over, all smiles and handshakes. Marshall waited a little longer, still nothing. A woman in a tight-fitting blazer, clearly one of the managers, walked past him without a second glance across the room. A tall, square-jawed salesman with slicked-back hair adjusted his Rolex chatter-ting. Up a man in a tailored suit. Marshall sighed and made his way to the reception desk. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "I'm looking for some assistance." The receptionist, a young blonde woman, barely glanced up from her screen. "One moment, sir." He waited and waited. After another awkward silence, the tall salesman with the Rolex finally took notice. With a slow, almost exaggerated exhale, he strolled over, looking Marshall up and down before forcing a thin smile. "Hey there," the man said. "Can I help you with something?" "Yeah." Marshall nodded towards the Mercedes-Benz. "I'm interested in that one over there." The salesman, Brad Jensen, let out a small laugh. Just a breath, but enough to be condescending. He glanced over at the car, then back at Marshall, his smile turning tight. "That S-Class?" Brad asked, tilting his head. "That's a premium model, pretty high price point." Marshall held his gaze. "I know." Brad exhaled sharply, shifting his weight. "Well, maybe I can show you something a little more practical. We got some nice certified pre-owned models in the back. Good mileage, great deals." Marshall didn't move. "I came here for that one." Brad's smile twitched. His eyes flickered toward his co-workers, as if silently asking if this was a joke when no one intervened. He sighed. "So," Brad said, lowering his voice slightly, "I just don't want to waste your time. These cars run 6 figures fully loaded. We're talking over $120,000 before tax. I mean, you sure this is in your price range?" Silence. Marshall's fingers curled in his pocket. Brad was still smiling, but there was something else in his eyes. Something Marshall had seen more times than he cared to count. Doubt, disbelief, dismissal. Marshall had spent a lifetime proving people like Brad wrong. His entire career. He had watched men in expensive suits underestimate him. He had walked into boardrooms where executives ignored him, only to later realize he was the one signing their paychecks. And yet, even now, at 72 years old, standing in a dealership he could buy 10 times over, he was still facing the same tired assumptions. But he wasn't about to explain himself to a man like Brad. Marshall took a slow breath, glancing at the car the one last time. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out the door. Brad shook his head as he watched him leave. "Guess he got the message," he muttered under his breath. But what Brad didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Marshall wasn't done just yet, because by tomorrow morning, he wouldn't just be walking into that dealership. He'd be walking in as the new owner. Marshall didn't go home right away. Instead, he pulled into the parking lot of the Silver Oak Club, a private lounge on the outskirts of Scottsdale, where he handled most of his business. It was quiet, discreet, the kind of place where deals got made over a glass of a bourbon inside. He took a seat in the back booth where the leather was worn from years of important conversations. He pulled out his phone and dialed. The call rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Marshall didn't expect to hear from you today." Raymond Ellis, his attorney and longtime friend, always answered his calls, A sharp, calculated man, Raymond had been handling Marshall's real estate empire for the last 20 years. "I need you to look into a business for me," Marshall said, setting his keys down on the table. Westward Mod, a luxury dealership off Camelback Road. There was a pause. "You looking to buy a car or buy the dealership?" Raymond's voice held a knowing edge. Marshall smirked. "We'll see. Just find out who owns it, and if they're selling, give me an hour." Marshall leaned back in the booth, watching the ice melt in his untouched drink. His mind replayed the moment. Over and over. The way Brad had looked at him. The way the receptionist never bothered to acknowledge him. He wasn't surprised by it. Not anymore. But that didn't mean he had to let it slide. An hour later, his phone buzzed. Raymond didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Marshall, you might have just found yourself an opportunity. I'm listening. Westward Motors is owned by Douglas Reiner, a guy out of California. He bought the dealership 5 years ago, but it's been bleeding money for the last 2. Marshall's fingers drummed against the table. How bad? Bad enough that he's been quietly looking for a buyer. He's got a few offers, but none of them are solid. Marshall exhaled slowly. "So if I come in with a real offer," Raymond chuckled, "he'll take it before you finish your sentence." Marshall didn't hesitate. "Set up a meeting for tonight." "You sure I don't like wasting time?" That was an understatement. Marshall built his empire by moving fast, seeing an opening and taking it before anyone else realized it was there by the time the sun had set over. Scottdale Raymond had arranged a call with Douglas Reiner. Marshall sat in his study, phone to his ear, listening as Douglas rattled off numbers. "Look, I won't lie to you. Douglas admitted the place is in trouble. Sales are down. We've had management issues, and I just don't have the time to turn it around." "How much?" Marshall asked. Douglas hesitated. "I'm looking for $6.2 million. Marshall leaned back in his chair. "I'll give you 5 cash and I can have the paper signed before the weekend." Another pause. 5 cash. Marshall didn't repeat himself. He never did. Douglas sighed. "You're serious about this, huh?" "Never been more serious." There was a long silence. Then finally Douglas spoke. "All right. You've got a deal." Marshall smiled to himself. By tomorrow morning, Westward Motors would belong to him. And when he walked through those doors, Brad Jensen would regret the day he ever sized him up the next morning. Westward Motors opened. As usual, the showroom lights flickered on. Salesmen took their positions, and Brad Jensen leaned against the desk, sipping his morning coffee like it was just another day. It wasn't at exactly 9:30 a.m. The dealership manager, Tom Caldwell, rushed onto the floor, his face pale, his usual confidence shaken. "All right, everybody, conference room." Now the urgency in his voice sent a ripple of confusion through the staff. "Something wrong, boss?" one of the salesmen asked. Tom rubbed his temple. Just get in there. You'll see." Brad rolled his eyes, setting his coffee down. "Probably another speech about hitting quotas," he muttered to a co-worker as they strolled into the glass-walled conference room. But the moment Brad stepped inside, he froze. Sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, hands clasped together, was Marshall Dupree, the same old man he had brushed off just yesterday, the same old man he had laughed at, and yet something was different. Gone was the quiet customer in the sweater and khakis. Today Marshall wore a tailored charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, no tie, casual but commanding. His Rolex glinted under the fluorescent lights, the same kind Brad prided himself on wearing. The air in the room shifted. Brad's confusion deepened as more people filed in, legal-looking types in business attire, some holding briefcases. Tom took a deep breath and turned to his staff. "Everyone meet your new boss." Silence for a moment. No one breathed. Then laughter, short, dry, coming from Brad. "This some kind of joke?" he asked, glancing around. Nobody laughed with him. Tom cleared his throat. "No joke. As of this morning, Mr. Dupree is the new owner of Westward Motors. The deal was finalized late last night." The words hit like a brick. Brad's jaw tightened. "What?" How Marshall leaned forward, finally speaking, his voice as smooth as ever. "See, Brad." He let the name sit in the air, letting it weigh down like a stone. "It's amazing what people can do when they don't waste their time judging others." Brad shifted in his seat. The cocky smirk faltering. Marshall turned his attention to the rest of the room. I was in here yesterday looking to buy a car. He said simply got ignored by most of you. Some of you saw me, dismissed me, figured I wasn't worth your time. A few employees shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Marshall let that sink in before continuing. But I don't hold grudges. What I do care about is how people are treated, and what I saw yesterday that won't fly under my ownership. The room stayed dead silent. Then Marshall's eyes landed on Brado. He said, lacing his fingers together, "Lee Tun talk about customer service." Brad swallowed hard. Marshall glanced at Tom. "Can you pull up the customer service reports from the last year?" Tom, still looking rattled, nodded and passed a thick folder down the table. Marshall flipped through a few pages, scanning H&M. "Let's see. Poor reviews, complaints about rude salespeople. Customers feeling dismissed." He turned a page, and look at that. Brad Jensen, the most named employee in these complaints. All eyes turned to Brad. His face burned red. Sir Brad started. "With all due respect," Marshall held up a hand. "Respect? That's funny. That's real funny coming from you." Brad shut his mouth. Marshall closed the folder and leaned back. "You made an assumption about me, Brad," he said, voice calm but firm, "and it cost you. You saw an old black man in a sweater and thought he wasn't worth your time." Brad clenched his jaw, gripping the arms of his chair. Marshall didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. But the truth is, he continued, "I'm the man who just bought this place. And let me be very clear. I have zero tolerance for people like you." Another pause. "Then you're fired." Brad's head snapped up. "Wait, what, you heard me?" Marshall's tone didn't change. "Clean out your desk." Brad shot a look at Tom, then at the legal team in the corner. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," Marshall said, standing up slowly. "And I suggest you take this moment to reflect, because the way you treated me, I promise you, I'm not the only one you've done this to. And sooner or later that kind of attitude catches up to a person." Brad opened his mouth, then shut it. Because deep down, he knew he had pushed his luck one too many times. Knew there was no walking this back without another word. He stormed out of the conference room. The tension in the room hung thick, but Marshall didn't dwell. He turned back to the staff. Now he said, voice smooth, "Once more for the rest of you. I have a few changes to make." The tension in the conference room still clung to the air. Long after Brad stormed out, some employees exchanged nervous glances, while others sat stiffly waiting to see what would happen next. Marshall stood at the head of the table, calm, composed, like a man who had done this 100 times before. "Now that we've gotten that out of the way," he said, dusting off his sleeves, "let's talk about what's changing around here." Tom, the dealership's manager, shifted in his seat. "Sir, if I may." "You may not." Tom snapped his mouth shut. "Marshall scanned the room yesterday. I walked in here ready to spend money. I wasn't asking for special treatment, just basic respect, and what did I get?" He let the question hang. "I was ignored, dismissed, and straight up insulted. Nobody dared to argue. And here's the kicker," Marshall continued. "I wasn't the first person to go through that. Probably wouldn't have been the last." A few employees looked down, suddenly very interested in their notepads. "But that ends today." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sheet of paper, placing it on the table. "This," he said, tapping the document, "is a new customer service policy. Effective immediately. Every single person who walks through those doors gets treated with the same level of respect, whether they walk in wearing a $5,000 suit or a t-shirt and jeans." Tom cleared his throat. "Sir, we already have customer service training." Clearly Marshall cut in. "It's not working." Silence. Marshall picked up the paper and started reading. "Rule number 1. No customer gets ignored. I don't care if they don't look like they can afford a car. If they step into the showroom, they get greeted and assisted like they're your top priority." Few nods. Nobody dared to protest. "Rule number 2. No judgments. We don't assume who can and can't afford something based on how they dress, how old they are, or what car they pull up in." One of the younger salesmen, a guy in his mid-20s, raised his hand hesitantly. "What about people who are just browsing?" Marshall looked at him directly. "You think I wasn't browsing yesterday?" The guy blinked. Let me tell you something." Marshall's voice remained even, but there was weight behind it. "When I was younger, I used to go into fancy stores just to see how they'd treat me. 9 times out of 10, I'd walk out because of attitudes like Brad's. He let that sink in before continuing. But that one time, that one person who treated me right, they got my business and they kept it for decades. That's how you build customers for life. The young salesman nodded, slowly understanding. Marshall continued. Rule number 3. We're done with commission-based greed. You sell cars, yes, but you're also here to serve customers. That means no shady sales tactics, no rushing people into deals they don't want, and no more condescending attitudes. Tom frowned. But, sir, commissions stay, Marshall clarified. But I'm restructuring how they work. Good salespeople won't have to push nonsense to make a living. Tom shut his mouth. Marshall looked around. Any questions? No one spoke. Good, he said, rolling up his sleeves, because the changes don't stop there. He motioned toward one of the legal assistants in the corner. The man stepped forward and handed Tom another document. Tom hesitated, flipping through the pages. Then his face went pale. He swallowed. This is a salary review, Marshall confirmed. I noticed that while some of you, his eyes flicked toward the junior staff, are making peanuts, others like Brad were sitting pretty despite multiple complaints. A few of the lower-ranking employees straightened in their chairs. That changes now. Marshall said, we're implementing fairer pay scales based on performance and customer feedback. If you do your job well, you'll be compensated accordingly. But if you treat customers like trash, he let that question hang, you won't be here long. A murmur rippled through the room. Some looked relieved, others anxious. Then Marshall clasped his hands together. Now he said with the smallest hint of a smile, let's get to work, because from this day forward, Westward Motors would never be the same. By the afternoon, word had already spread across the dealership. The new policies, the firing of Brad, the fact that the man they had ignored just yesteryear was now their boss. The energy, and the showroom floor had shifted. Some employees whispered nervously, unsure of their future. Others, especially the younger, overlooked staff, felt a quiet sense of relief. Maybe things would finally change for the better. Marshall didn't sit back and let the day run itself. He walked the floor, hands in his pockets, watching how things operated. At one point he saw a young salesman, Darren, standing awkwardly by the entrance. He wasn't approaching customers like the others, just waiting. Unsure, Marshall strolled over. You waiting for permission to do your job, he asked. Darren blinked. No, sir, he hesitated. It's just, well, I don't usually get the good customers. Marshall raised an eyebrow, twinning. Good, Darren scratched his head. You know, the ones who actually buy. Marshall let out a slow breath. Come with me. Without waiting, he led Darren to the glass doors, a few feet away. An older black man in a faded polo shirt and scuffed sneakers stood near the lot, hesitating at the entrance. He looked unsure, like he wasn't sure if he even belonged there. Marshall stopped. What do you see? Darren glanced at the man. A customer. Did you think that 10 seconds ago? Darren didn't answer. Marshall smiled. Go greet him. Darren hesitated. Then finally he straightened his shoulders and stepped forward. Good afternoon, sir, Darren said, voice steady. Can I help you with anything today? The older man looked surprised. He glanced around as if checking to make sure Darren was actually talking to him. Yeah, he said slowly. I was just looking, not sure I can afford anything in here. Darren smiled. No pressure, but if you'd like, I can show you around. We have some great financing options. If you find something you like. The man blinked. And for the first time, he relaxed. Yeah, he said, I'd like that. Marshall watched the interaction with quiet approval. Darren had just learned something Brad never did. That respect costs nothing, but could gain everything. As the two walked toward the cars, Tom, the dealership manager, walked up beside Marshall. You really think all these changes will stick? Tom asked, arms crossed. Marshall didn't look at him. They don't have a choice. Tom exhaled through his nose. You really bought this place just to prove a point? Marshall chuckled. I don't make million dual deals over a point. He turned to Tom. I bought this place because it was broken, and I don't invest in anything unless I know I can fix it. Tom nodded slowly. He may not have liked everything that happened today, but he understood it. Marshall started walking again, leaving Tom standing there before stepping into his office. He turned one last time watching Darren and the older man laughing over a car's interior a day ago. That customer would have been ignored today. He was valued, and that was the difference. Never judge someone by their appearance. The way you treat people, especially those you think can't do anything for you, will always come back around. Some lessons are learned the hard way. Brad learned it, Westward Motors learned it, and now hopefully so will everyone watching.